Welcome to the VO2 Lounge podcast. Today, we will be looking at how much muscle can you build with and without steroids and their side effects. By the end of this podcast, we will know what the physiological and supraphysiological limits of building muscle is comparing to natural bodybuilders with enhanced bodybuilders, the amount of additional muscle that can be built with the use of steroids, an understanding of common steroids used in the real world, the dose response of steroids, including the differences between true TRT dosages and supraphysiological doses, and finally, an understanding of the common side effects associated with steroid abuse. PEDs, specifically steroid use, has been around for years, almost 100 years at this point, with testosterone being the first synthesized somewhere around the 1930s. To use a fancier word, anabolic and androgenic steroids are widely abused today and possibly ever since their conception by elite and recreational athletes of all descriptions, with the aim of increasing muscle mass and strength. It's not exclusive to bodybuilding, really. Any sport all sports really have damage to the muscle, whether that's cycling, running, bodybuilding, rugby where mass is more important, anything where maintaining, gaining muscle mass, or just recovering from bouts of exercise, forms of steroids and testosterone in general are going to be performance enhancing. There is obviously a ban in a large number of elite competitions, but depending on the level of rigor used in the testing protocol or the anti-doping protocol, and let's call it the tenacity of the athlete and training team, they still find a way to go undetected. So don't forget though that there are sports like bodybuilding with untested categories, and some parts of cycling, for example, where the only anti-doping control is testing the top 5 athletes at the end of a race. Nothing in season, or that is at least done rigorously, which is more than enough time for the exogenous substances, the performance enhancing substances, to make their way out of the bloodstream and go undetected. So let's start with natural bodybuilders. Obviously, I know in the fitness industry now, this is a little bit of a contentious word, but let's just have some faith and assume that we are talking honest, natural bodybuilders. Now, this takes us back to an old study from 1995 titled Fat-Free Mass Index in Users and Non-Users of Anabolic Androgenic Steroids. From this study, we can take out a few key points. Firstly, what is and how is fat-free mass index calculated? So fat-free mass index equals the fat-free mass divided by the height squared. This is exactly what it sounds like, the relationship between fat-free mass, which is everything in the body that is not body fat, which includes muscle, organs, bones, water, glycogen, connective tissue, etc., and comparing that to height. Now, during this study, the researchers actually found, in their own words, that the tallest athletes are not only taller but also wider and thicker than the shorter athletes of apparently comparable muscularity. Thus, the tallest athletes score somewhat higher on the FFMI equation. This then led them to develop a normalized fat-free mass index, which is normalized fat-free mass index equals fat-free mass index plus 6.1 times 1.8 minus height. This makes for a much easier comparison between athletes of different heights and for more consistent results. This kind of sort of takes us back, if you think, to a very early episode I did on VO2 max, where you've got absolute VO2 max, which is essentially FFMI, where you are literally just looking at liters per minute, and in this case fat-free mass over height, whereas then you've got relative VO2 max, which is milliliters of oxygen per minute per kilo, and so it's normalizing it to the body mass, which means when you've got two athletes and you're looking at their results, you can now clearly see who has what is going to make the biggest difference on the other end to their VO2 max. So that's what you've got here. You've got a normalized value. It means if you are 2 meters tall and your friend is 1.5 meters tall, you can both compare or at least you could look at two athletes that you are maybe somewhat suspicious of and go, oh, okay, he's this tall. Once corrected, his fat-free mass is below X, which means I believe him to not be enhanced. Now, on to that. Now, getting to the point, the general consensus from this study is that there is an approximate cutoff of 25 kilograms per meter squared. That is the amount of fat-free mass that you can see on an individual. They determined it to be 25 kilos per meter squared, which gives you essentially this value that if you see someone over it, you could say suspicious. Now, of course, there are some exceptions to this rule, but that's exactly what it is, an exception. The reality is that most, if not everyone listening now, is not one of the exceptions. You have to think that this is a theoretical limit, and most people are not going to be anywhere near this limit. It's not to do, it's not just simply that, okay, if you're not reaching it, it's because you haven't got the right training, the right nutrition, the right lifestyle, and so on and so forth. No, it's saying that even with all those things in a line, you still have got to look at your genetic component as to where that ceiling actually is. And what this is suggesting is that the ceiling is 25 kilograms per meter squared. It's worth noting that one of the possible exceptions is people with higher body fat percentage. Now, in the researchers' own words, they stated that our formula may not be satisfactory for fat individuals. Now, take a moment here. We're not talking obese people, because you'll see in a minute the fat percentage. Because a gain in the fat component of the body is consistently accompanied by some gain in lean component, it is possible that individuals might be able to exceed substantially an FFMI of 25 without the use of steroids. Because our sample of non-users only included 6 men with body fat levels greater than 20%, it's probably hazardous to generalize the findings of fat individuals. Now, I would never 20% is not exactly like you're walking down the street and you go, man, that guy, he's pretty fat. That is, to me, not the biggest number. So you can clearly see that people can get over that, but still, again, it's an exception. For most people, if you've got like 40 friends and they're all over 25 kg per meter squared, chances are at least 38 of them are enhanced, unless you just happen to know the golden population. But you get the picture. Now, what are steroids? Because obviously we know them colloquially as just being like these things that make you bigger, so on and so forth. But, okay, using the term anabolic androgenic steroids, or AAS, are a class of natural and synthetic hormones that owe their name to their chemical structure, which is the steroid nucleus, and the biological effects, anabolic and androgenic, that they induce. So, anabolic androgenic steroids, nice and easy. Anabolic refers to the skeletal muscle building properties of steroids, whereas androgenic refers to the induction and maintenance of male secondary sexual characteristics, which in principle includes the anabolic action. So, there you go. Now, testosterone is the primary endogenous hormone belonging to this class. It's widely used therapeutically in various estified forms as replacement therapy in male hypogonadism, so essentially TRT, testosterone, and a select few other steroids such as nandrolone and oxandrolone, might also be prescribed for other medical conditions, for example, osteoporosis or aplastic anemia. Besides these valid medical uses, steroids are widely abused for their muscle building and strength increasing properties in dosages far exceeding those used therapeutically. We'll discover later in this episode what those actually are, but people might get, regardless of whether they've ever used them themselves, people might feel the word abused as very much of like an attack almost, but simply under a lot of these studies, under the medically kind of literature and under the kind of more colloquial terminology as well, still, abused is used simply because we'll see later the kind of dosages, but the dosages we're sort of trying to get into when it comes to like enhanced individuals. The reason it's that is because it far out exceeds what the amount of dosage an individual would need, regardless of how poorly functioning their system is, to maintain a physiological level of testosterone. These higher dosages, regardless of peak or trough, are still way above, and it's considered abuse at that point because it is no longer therapeutic. That's all where the terminology comes from. Now, as a quick summary of how these are metabolized once in the bloodstream after being injected intramuscularly or taken orally, anabolic androgenic steroids, including testosterone, bind to various proteins like albumin, sex hormone binding globulin, which is SHBG, corticosteroid binding globulin, which is CBG, and erythrocytoid. Now, under normal conditions, testosterone primarily binds to albumin and SHBG, with only 1% to 4% circulating in an unbound state, so that free testosterone. Now, SHBG exhibits high affinity but limited binding capacity, while albumin with low affinity offers virtually limitless binding capacity. In physiological conditions, about 1/3 of SHBG binding sites are occupied by testosterone, with approximately 44% remaining unbound due to the presence of other steroids. Now, supraphysiological testosterone dosages saturate SHBG's binding capacity and significantly increase circulating SHBG levels. Now, consequently, increasing testosterone dosages lead to a higher fraction binding to albumin than SHBG. Now, notably, SHBG shows very low affinity for other commonly used steroids such as nandrolone, methanolone, stanozol, methendienone, and fluoxamous testosterone. Now, some of these words, these are easier to just, I'd say, to get a clear picture of what these are all called. Simply, most medical websites will have a list of commonly used substances by individuals. So I'll now go through just a list of different off-the-shelf brand names. The long-form chemical names, they are a bit funky, shall we say, and most of these are fresh to my vocabulary, and I'll just be fumbling through. So I'm going to give the name of the prescription, and then if I've managed to find out what the colloquial or slang terminology for these are, which people have more likely heard, at least I have definitely more likely heard them, then I'll give those as well. So on the oral administered products, you've got halostatin, which is also referred to as halo. You've got proviron. You've got dianabol or dbol. You've got virolon. You've got check. You've got anavar or oxandrin, or var is the colloquial term. You've got anadrol, or referred to as drol colloquially. You've got winstrol or winnie. Then moving on to the intramuscular injectable forms, you've got equipoise or EQ. You've got primobolan, which is also referred to as primo. You've got durabolin, or deca. You've got durabolin, which is also known as NPP. You've got depot test, androestro, testex, and Finajet, which is tren. So all these are the commonly used substances by, specifically, really, it looks like bodybuilders. Now, some of these, I assume, are also administered in a clinical setting in, for example, TRT, but these are the common terminology you'll probably hear thrown around a gym, a CrossFit area, maybe in some kind of sports like running and cycling, or just people referring to them because they've heard about them or they're interested, so on and so forth. Now getting on to the true effects of steroids and why people are using them. Obviously we know the muscle enhancing, but how much are we getting out of them, so on and so forth. Now, I think it's best, before getting into the nuance of the next study that I've researched, it would be good to have some context on the dosages you're about to hear. Now, for reference, these are all weekly dosages. So in a therapeutic session, or therapeutic hormone replacement, or TRT, the dosages will be around 100 milligram range. Now, that isn't every single time someone goes there, it's 100 milligrams. Doesn't matter who the person is. I've taken this to, my understanding is, obviously they are probably targeting a serum level, and 100 milligrams is probably the upper end of what anyone is going to need who's hypogonadal to return normal function and eliminate any symptoms of their low testosterone. At 150 to 200 milligrams, this is going to be significantly enhanced amount of testosterone perpetually, like continuously enhanced. Even their trough could be, if you were to take a sample at the trough, it may just look like they are a high performing individual / they just have a high test score. But then if you were to look at their peak, you're like, well, this is blown out of the water. Now, think of this as being all those kind of fitness influencers that you think are on something, or like film people who you think are on something, that you're like, yeah, either you got great genetics or you are just juicing on something. It's kind of these kind of values, like 100 to 200 milligrams is going to give you that kind of somewhat outrageous physique with not necessarily a dialed everything. Then we're going to get on to 600 milligrams. Now, it'll become clear later why I've chosen 600 milligrams to define this point, but this is considered somewhat of an entry-level bodybuilder dosage, but definitely supraphysiological, like really enhanced. And then elite bodybuilders on the top level, these mass monster individuals, this is kind of where it becomes throwing shit at the wall, and on occasion people are as high as 4,000 milligrams, so 4 grams, but it's really anywhere between 1,000 milligrams to 4,000 milligrams. So now there's an understanding of the dosages, let's get into the study. The study was titled The Effects of Supraphysiological Doses of Testosterone on Muscle Size and Strength in Normal Men. This dates back to 1996. It's not the newest of studies, but is widely referred to for this topic. So for some background, the authors stated that anabolic androgenic steroids are widely abused by athletes and recreational bodybuilders because of the perception that these substances increase muscle mass and strength. But this premises is unsubstantiated. Now, testosterone replacement increases nitrogen retention and fat-free mass in castrated animals and hypogonadal men. But whether the supraphysiological doses of testosterone or other anabolic androgenic steroids augment muscle mass and strength in normal men is still currently unknown. So they were suggesting that prior to this study, they had seen benefits in men who have testosterone production issues, and clearly a castrated animal where they have no testosterone generation capability. But in a male who already produces testosterone normally, what would the benefits be? Or what would the effects be, shall we say? So the method used included assigning 43 normal men, and now by normal I mean normal functioning men, to one of the 4 groups: placebo with no exercise, testosterone with no exercise, placebo plus exercise, and testosterone plus exercise. So kind of covering the 4 bases that you could possibly be. The men received injections of 600 milligrams of testosterone, threonate, or a placebo for 10 weeks. That's where I've used the 600 milligrams. You could say 500 to 600 is really enhanced, but I just picked 600 because that is what they've used in the study. But as you can see, that is almost 6 times higher than the amount given for therapeutic usages. However, still at best only half that taken by elite bodybuilders in the present day. But you're going to see these results are bonkers. The men in the exercise groups performed standardized weightlifting exercise 3 times weekly. Before and after the treatment period, fat-free mass was determined by underwater weighing. Muscle size was measured by magnetic response imaging, MRI, and the strength of the arms and legs were assessed by bench press and squatting exercises respectively. Now, their results showed that for the men in the non-exercise groups, those given testosterone had a greater increase than those given the placebo in muscle size in the arms and legs, and greater increase in strength in the bench press. The men assigned to the testosterone and exercise had greater increase in fat-free mass, which was on average 6.1 kilograms. I know, ridiculous. And muscle size than those assigned to either non-exercise group, and greater increase in muscle strength than either non-exercise group. From this, it's obvious that they concluded the supraphysiological doses of testosterone, especially when combined with strength training, increase fat-free mass and muscle size and strength in normal men. Now, taking some time to look into the results a little more, let's look at the results of each 4 of the measurements taken and see how they differ across the participants. Now, the fat-free mass, so the placebo non-exercise group, this group gained sub 1 kilo of lean mass, as to be expected. They're not doing exercise, and then they're not on any form of steroid, so you wouldn't expect them to do anything crazy. Now, the testosterone group with no exercise, somewhere in the range of 3 kilograms in comparison to the non-drug training group, who only gained 2 kilograms. So these people didn't even go to the gym and they gained more mass. And then the testosterone and exercise group, as we already stated, here we go, 6.1 kilograms increase over the 10-week period, which is honestly absurd. Now, moving on to kind of the area, interestingly, so the tricep, the training group saw very little change. Very little change at all. The non-training group, it went down. The training group, it changed very little. But then in the testosterone and training with testosterone group, as you would kind of expect from that, there isn't much difference in how much gain they saw. They're very similar, which is kind of worrying in the sense. I mean, you can see the mass gains here. It's kind of it's crazy. But in the quad, possibly maybe because the size of the muscle in the first place and the amount of volume that can go through it and its ability to grow effectively, the training group without steroids and the steroid group is still larger without training than the non-steroid group, but then we do then see a much bigger increase and a bigger delta between the steroid non-training group and the steroid training group. Now, onto the actual strength metrics. This is where we get some hope back for society, and business kind of returns to normal. So the placebo non-exercise group, essentially showing no deviation from baseline. The test no exercise group showed almost an 18 kilogram increase on squat and 10 on the bench press. The placebo and exercise group finally outshone the non-exercise test group and showed a 25 kilo increase on the squat, 12 kilos on the bench, It isn't a big difference, and I admit these I'm reading off a graph, not exactly kind of pinpoint numbers, so there could be a little bit of deviation if you had the raw data, but essentially they have slightly eked out the non-training but enhanced group, and then the enhanced with exercise group, again the largest results seen here with an increase of approximately 30 kilos on the squat and 20 on the bench. Again, absurd. Now obviously this episode is not titled how much strength can you add on steroids, but it's still interesting. But more importantly, as the muscle mass you are able to gain is going to be directly correlated to the amount of weight you can push to some extent, not necessarily saying that a powerlifter is going to have put on more muscle than a bodybuilder because they're lifting more weight. No, but two bodybuilders who one's lifting 100 kilos for 15 reps and the other's lifting 50 kilos for 15 reps, that other one is going to be able to put more mass on, so this strength increase is then going to be a proxy for also further mass increase. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the sponsor of this episode, the share button. The share button allows you to share content like this podcast with all your friends in just a few taps. Studies show that 90% of podcast growth comes from the combination of clicking the share button and word of mouth alone. Only joking, I don't have any data on it, but anecdotally, sharing this podcast is the best way to get it to grow. So let's make it the case for this podcast that 90% of growth comes from you guys sharing by word of mouth and clicking the share button. Now, back to the episode. At this point, you might be now thinking that from this study, we have only gained insight into the dose response associated with 0 milligrams, so completely natural, and 600 milligrams, which is significantly enhanced. What about dosages between 600 milligrams and 0? Well, another paper titled Testosterone Dose Response Relationship in Healthy Young Men, published in 2001, attempts to answer this very question. The study design was that the study involved 61 eugonadal men aged 18 to 35, so correctly functioning and adequate levels of testosterone in their system. These participants were divided into 5 groups, and each group received a monthly injection of a long-acting gonadotropin-releasing hormone, GnRH, agonist to suppress endogenous testosterone secretion. This, I think, is really clearly a good design in that sense, because then you are eliminating any of the variability in the individuals from at least the standpoint of basal production. Obviously you're still going to have some natural variation in how they respond to the drug itself, but at least you've eliminated any drastic differences between their baselines. So additionally, participants in each group received weekly injections of different dosages of testosterone ethionate. Now this is 25 milligrams, 50 milligrams, 125, 300, or 600 milligrams, and this was for a duration of 20 weeks. It's worth noting that the 25 milligram dosages is going to probably end up with those individuals being lower than their actual physiological levels, so that is kind of reflected later in some of the results. But the participants were provided with standardized diets where energy intake was set at 36 kilocalories per kilogram of body weight per day, and the protein intake was at 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. So as you can see here, again, trying to eliminate any dietary differences specifically around the calorie intake and the protein intake, which both calorie surplus would allow for greater muscle growth, and greater protein in diet, again, would facilitate greater muscle protein synthesis and therefore greater muscle mass gain. Interesting to add to this, participants were instructed not to engage in strength training or moderate to heavy endurance exercise throughout the study. So this is all purely with a stimulus of exogenous testosterone. What does the body respond with? Does it suddenly go, whoa, I got all this testosterone, may as well have more muscle? Not, here's a stimulus external to the body, here is this increase in testosterone, I shall gain more muscle. It's just more testosterone, should I gain more muscle from a baseline. Now the testosterone concentrations, these were graded doses of testosterone resulting in varying low points of testosterone concentrations ranging from 250 to 2,370 nanograms per deciliter. So you can see how big this range actually is. As for the body composition, fat-free mass increased dose dependently in men receiving 125, 300 or 600 milligrams of testosterone weekly. The changes in fat-free mass were highly dependent on the testosterone dose, showing a positive correlation with testosterone concentration. To be specific, on the weight gain, under water weighing was 7.9 kilograms for the 600, 5.2 for the 300, and 3.4 for the 125. And then what's also good to note is that clearly the 125 on average gave these people somewhat of a natural level because they only gained 0.6 kilograms, whereas at the 25 milligram dosage they actually lost muscle mass. They went down by a kilo. Now comparing this to DEXA results, at the low end it was still 0.4, so it was kind of baseline. 1.1 for 50 milligrams, 125 milligrams saw 2.9, 300 saw 5.5, and then 600 saw 8.9 kilograms. So this is double the duration of the previous study, which was 10 weeks. This is now 20 weeks, but this is no exercise. So this is like group 2, let's say, in the previous study where they were given testosterone with no exercise. Whether the protein intake and the caloric intake were the same, I don't know. But essentially, you can kind of see here how absurd the body is on this. Now, muscle size and strength changes in the leg press, strength, leg power, thigh and quadricep muscle volume were positively correlated again with the testosterone concentration. Now this suggests that muscle size and strength increase with higher testosterone levels, of course, as you would kind of expect. And then other physiological changes were that hemoglobin levels, high density lipoprotein, so HDL, cholesterol, and insulin-like growth factor 1, which is IGF-1, levels showed positive correlation with testosterone concentrations. And on the other hand, changes in fat mass and plasma HDL cholesterol were negatively correlated. Now, other functions such as sexual function, visual, spatial cognition, and mood were also assessed, including prostate-specific antigen PSA. Now, levels did not change significantly at any dose during this study. There have been people to review this since, suggesting that cohort size and duration of study in some cases not being representative of the real world now may be the result why none of these negative outcomes that will come later are picked up. But at least from their standpoint, there were no negative side effects discovered. They concluded that the study concludes that the changes in circulating testosterone concentrations induced by the combination of GnRH agonist and testosterone administration are associated with dose and concentration dependent alterations in various physiological parameters, and the relationship between the testosterone dose and the different androgen dependent processes are not uniform, suggesting that these processes respond differently to changes in testosterone levels. I think a major takeaway from this study, however, is just like any kind of physical activity, whether it's gaining muscle naturally without the use of exogenous substances, there's an incredible amount of heterogeneity between people and steroid administration, and the researchers' thoughts can be summarized as, despite the correlation between testosterone dose concentration and changes in fat-free mass and muscle size, there was considerable heterogeneity in response to testosterone administration within each individual group. Individual differences in response may be attributed to factors such as activity level, testosterone metabolism, nutrition, or genetic variations in relevant receptors and regulators. So simply, two people given the same amount aren't going to end up at the same place for a slew of different reasons, just like previously stated, the 25 kilos per meter squared is not a hard and fast rule, and is more of a general guide, but isn't going to necessarily say where everyone's physiological ceilings are. Some are going to be slightly over, some are going to be drastically under, and that's just the way it is. I know I haven't specifically stated where, it's because we've got the natural ceiling of 25 kilos per meter squared, but we don't necessarily have one for an enhanced individual, simply because there just doesn't seem to be a number on it. It's going to be, as I said, dose dependent. So you would essentially just have to do one for every 100 milligrams of where the new ceiling is. But that isn't really going to happen because it's a very long form study. You'd have to just simply go to people, first of all, check that they've reached their physiological limit naturally, so that you can verify that the limit they are now reaching is an enhanced limit. And it's just a bit complex. But essentially, for most people, the limit is going to be so high that probably not going to want to get there. It's probably dangerous to get there. And there's not really a reason to want to know where it is. This is the point where the episode turns from these what could be considered desirable effects to the negative side effects of these exogenous substances. Now, to learn about these, we can look at a study titled Anabolic Androgenic Steroids, How They Work and What Are the Risks. This is published in 2022. So the most recent of the studies referred to. So we have erythrocytosis, which is an increase in blood hematocrit or hemoglobin levels. And it's a common side effect of steroids, including on replacement dosages, particularly noted in older men receiving testosterone replacement therapy. We've already referred to it, TRT. Now, short-acting testosterone injections have a higher erythrocytosis incidence compared to long-acting forms and other TRT formulations, likely due to the serum concentration fluctuations. Simply, I'm assuming the short-acting, large doses that high peak comes down, high peak comes down, high peak, versus the more steady state administration. In young men, 600 milligrams weekly testosterone ethionate for 20 weeks increased hemoglobin levels by 1.4 grams per deciliter. This increased blood viscosity from elevated hematocrit is associated with thrombosis, also known as blood clotting. And now there's no reason for me to explain why that's a bad thing. Everyone understands clots. No good when they're occurring in your blood. Well, I suppose they're good if you have a scab, but inside the body. Don't want a clot. Acne, which is really the one for me, before even researching this, is the one you hear of. It's commonly reported side effects by steroid users, but research shows there does appear to be a disconnect between self-reporting of this side effect and visual examination by a physician. The study showed that the prevalence of self-reported acne increased from 10% at the start of a study or a start of a cycle to 52% by the end, whereas the visual examination by a physician showed a smaller increase from 13 to 29%. This discrepancy can be largely ascribed to steroid users classifying a few pimples or spots as acne, which is sort of part of human nature and not isolated to these individuals. There could also be kind of a user bias to some extent / environmental bias of people saying it's going to happen. So you see a couple of spots and you go, oh my god, I've got acne from these drugs. The higher percentage of self-reported acne might also reflect the occurrence of this side effect at other points in time during the steroid cycle, which would have been missed by visual examination at the end of the cycle. So just suggesting that maybe they reported having it because they saw it during a cycle, and then afterwards it's cleared up, and now the physician said, "No, you haven't got acne." To manage the side effects, individuals may also choose to take additional prescription medication on top of what they are already taking for their muscle growth. So compounding further exogenous substances to cope with side effects, which is commonplace. As you'll see, any side effect has a resulting drug that could be used to suppress the side effect to allow you to do more anabolic agents, which results in greater prevalence of the side effects, which results in greater use of other prescription substances or not prescription substances to mediate the effects. Male pattern hair loss, again, quite common topic, because I think even outside of exogenous steroid use, individuals who suffer from it, it's kind of a big deal for some people. Some people don't mind just shaving it all off. Others, it's part of their identity. So it is a highly reported and highly spoken about topic. Now, male pattern baldness driven by androgens is noticeably influenced by testosterone and its conversion to dihydrotestosterone, DHT, through the enzyme 5A reductase. Castration and 5A reductase deficiency have been linked to a lack of male pattern baldness. Finasteride inhibits 5A reductase, offering pharmaceutical treatments for hair loss in general, irrelevant of the use of steroids. Now, concurrent drug use, including potential hair loss promoting compounds, complicates interpretation. Despite limited evidence, some steroid users use minoxidil and 5A reductase inhibitors like finasteride and dutasteride to counteract this hair loss. Now, the effectiveness of 5A reductase inhibitors is established in clinical practice, but their use alongside the steroid doses is questionable. Increasing androgenic action from supraphysiological testosterone levels may compensate for any DHT lowering effect. And additionally, some commonly used steroids are already 5A reduced or exhibit limited 5A reduction. Now, it's just where it gets into this murky world of why you probably also do see a lot of side effects and a lot of other kind of issues, or reported issues in some cases, because really it's the further along I read on the topic, the further you realize how complicated really it is. It isn't just a case of you buy one substance, someone administers it, and happy days going down the road, you become massive. There's just this long list of various things you need to keep an eye on, various other substances that are often used to manage the side effects. And it's just, you almost need your own pharmacy and your own private physician to manage all these other things. Hypertension or high blood pressure is also a side effect associated with it. And that's a critical risk factor for cardiovascular disease and shows increased prevalence in some individuals who use steroids. Studies have reported a notable rise in systolic and diastolic blood pressure during steroid use, with 41% of subjects experiencing hypertension. And the mechanism behind this induced hypertension involves vasoconstriction through various different pathways. Again, users in some cases resort to hypertensive prescription medication to manage said issue. Testosterone deficiency further down the line can become an issue. So the production of testosterone in the testes is regulated by the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, which is the HPGA, gonadotropin releasing hormone GnRH from the hypothalamus. It stimulates the release of luteinizing hormone, or LH, and follicle stimulating hormone FSH from the pituitary, which in turn control testosterone production and spermogenesis. Now, exogenous anabolic androgenic steroids use disrupts this very axis, causing a negative feedback that suppresses endogenous testosterone production and spermogenesis, persisting even after the cessation of using these anabolic agents. Now, recovery from HPGA varies among individuals and heavily relying on genetics and the level of abuse seen, and then the recovery modality used post-cycle, because people will then either will manage this, understanding it's going to be an issue, and try maintain function, and then try make the process quicker on the other end. But it's incredibly variable and something that is thought of in some cases. Now, recent data suggests that 90% chance of normal testosterone levels 3 months post steroid cessation, when gonadal function was normal before the cycle. That's kind of a key point. The way I interpreted that was, say you do it 12 week, 20 week, however long the person does the cycle for, right, and they lose a bit of function, and then that compounds to the point where they come in to a cycle with non-normal gonadal function, and therefore they no longer fit in this bucket of it resumes to normal function after 3 months, or they don't even have a 3-month break in the first place, which means it just shuts off completely. Now, ancillary drugs, part of post-cycle therapy, PCT, are commonly used by steroid users to aid HPGA recovery. PCT involves selective estrogen receptor modulators, or SERMs, aromatase inhibitors, and human chronic gonadotropin, which is HCG, while SERMs and aromatase inhibitors increase testosterone levels. Their efficacy in steroid-induced hypergonadism remains a bit uncertain, and a lot of this because really where the chances of people doing extensive research, publishing it on these somewhat niche subset of the community, of the world in general, is unlikely. People resort to things like forums, word of mouth, just what's going on in the gym to get this information, which is then where you see these horrific recovery processes or loss of testicular function in general, and so on and so forth. Now, infertility is another thing which is probably somewhat obvious given the previous topic, but spermogenesis, regulated by the hypothalamic pituitary gland axis, HPGA again, is essential for male fertility. LH and FSH stimulate spermogenesis, and steroid use disrupts this process by suppressing gonadotropin secretion and intertesticular testosterone. Now, exogenous testosterone, even at doses exceeding testosterone replacement therapy, cannot support spermogenesis due to severe internal intratesticular testosterone suppression. Now, suppression of spermogenesis leads to testicular atrophy, often considered a cosmetic issue for some bodybuilders, and some steroid users may use HCG or human menopausal gonadotropin to maintain testes volume without necessarily aiming to preserve fertility. Now, recovery of spermogenesis post steroid use varies among individuals. Studies on hormonal male contraception suggest that median recovery time of 5.5 months for sperm count to return to baseline, but caution is needed when extrapolating these findings to steroid users. Really, recovery may be delayed in users injecting estified steroids with long half-lives. Research indicates mean times to recover of sperm output and concentration after steroid use of 14 and 10.5 months respectively. So these are long kind of recovery processes, And again, dose dependent, cycle duration dependent, other exogenous substance use dependent. The list kind of goes on. Another one listed is erectile dysfunction. Now this can be influenced by testosterone levels directly. Now, testosterone deficiency is considered a suggestive symptom of erectile dysfunction, but not all hypogonadal men experience it, and testosterone replacement therapy typically shows only modest improvements. Erectile dysfunction can have various causes, including psychogenic, ergogenic, or a mix of both. Now, in the context of anabolic and steroids, erectile dysfunction can arise as a post-cycle side effect due to the impact that the anabolic steroids on testosterone levels post-cycle and the suppression, and it's like a vicious circle. However, it's crucial to recognize that erectile dysfunction in steroid users may not solely be resulted of the steroid use and could indicate an underlying psychocharacter disorder. Now, the nature of erectile dysfunction can help identify potential causes. Next, everyone's favorite, all the ones that you've heard many a times before, gynecomastia, the most feared side effect, the one people actively will manage and get rid of before going on stage, kind of thing. Now, the benign enlargement of glandular tissue of the breast is what gynecomastia is, and is a condition resulting from an imbalance of androgenic and estrogenic action on breast tissue. It often develops during puberty and remains prevalent in adulthood. The root cause is hormonal, involving an absolute or relative deficiency of androgenic action or an absolute or relative excess of estrogenic action in the breast tissue. Now, gynecomastia can occur as a side effect of anabolic androgenic steroid use, but during steroid use, the prevalence of gynecomastia increases from 7% at baseline to 19% at the end of a cycle. This is just based again on various studies. Now, the development of gynecomastia during steroid use is attributed to an absolute excess of estrogenic action, even though estradiol levels increase dose dependently with testosterone administration. Steroid users may believe that gynecomastia could be caused by alternative pathways such as increased progestin action or elevated prolactin levels. However, there is no evidence to support these claims, and self-medication with dopamine agonists to lower assumed increased prolactin levels is discouraged due to potential side effects. That is directly from the study. They're discouraging against it. But that highlights again the other kind of mad scientist concoctions that people are using to get around said side effects. Now, while anti-estrogenic drugs like aromatase inhibitors and selective estrogen receptor modulators, SERMs, are used off-label or in clinical trials to treat gynecomastia, the efficacy of aromatase inhibitors appears to be poor, while SERMs like tamoxifen have shown better results. That's essentially, again, what they are suggesting. But at least from the list, at least gynecomastia itself, purely a visual nuisance. Of course, most, if not all, of these side effects are specifically targeting men, but women also can use these substances, do use these substances, and do have side effects. So the use of anabolic androgenic steroids in women is less common than in men, but it does occur, especially among female strength athletes, bodybuilders, powerlifters, so on and so forth. And it's probably now in other sports like rugby, fighting, combat sports, so on. Women who use steroids often opt for shorter cycles. Different types of steroids such as stanozol and oxandrolone and are used, and lower dosages compared to men. Kind of somewhat obvious, I suppose, because males' levels are higher, to get a relative percentage increase, you have to use a bigger dose, because women's baseline is lower. To get a relative increase, say like 10-fold increase, rather than having to pump in 5,000 milligrams or 1,000 or 4,000, whatever the number is, the absolute value ends up being lower for the same relative increase. While there's less data available on the effects of steroids use in women, it is possible to extrapolate some of the effects based on known impact of supraphysiological androgen levels in men. Now, in general, across loads of these studies to do with loads of topics, you will often find that they are on men. And it's important to address that, because it's hard to extrapolate between sexes, and that one of the big reasons this is and can be the case is men's hormonal state, to some extent, is like a flat line. Obviously it's not, but compared to a woman's hormonal profile, you would essentially have to have X number of women that you screen for X period of time, ensure to some extent, that their cycles are as closely aligned as possible, and that their characteristics of said profile, of said cycle, are as aligned as possible. Which means, say you had a 20-week trial, you almost need 5 weeks, 4, 8, 12. You almost need another 20 weeks to characterize the women, and then screen for effectively cycle start, cycle end, and cycle characteristic, to either then normalize for any changes, or at least be able to state that, okay, we were giving them this dose on this day, but these women that were in this part of their cycle resulting in this response, which means that person isn't actually a high responder. It's just that because of where they are in their cycle, it benefited them better than the other woman. So you can see where these topics are so complicated already. And I'm sure there's other reasons, because of the way society is, that women aren't represented as much in these studies, but men provide a far easier datum point to perform said studies on. But back to said side effects. So in women, steroid use can lead to various adverse effects, including disruptions in blood pressure, erythrocytosis, again, increased red blood cell count, alterations in lipid profile, changes in cardiac structure. It can also have viralizing effects in women, leading to significant clinical concerns. Some of these effects include deepening of the voice, which in reality, if you kind of not necessarily anecdotally or somewhat objectively just look around and listen to podcasts and so on and so forth, the women who are open about it and have taken it and voices are deepened, it's not a process that reverts. It's not like you take the test out and they suddenly come back to a higher pitched voice. Even at relatively low dosages, women may experience deepening of the voice. Studies have shown that post-menopausal women receiving nandrolone superimposed on hormonal replacement therapy reported voice complaints and exhibited changes in speech frequency. So you can see how, to some, that will be quite uncomfortable, disturbing, change of identity, so on and so forth, which is somewhat more of a concern for women on hormone replacement therapy, because they are doing it for a reason, but you almost feel like, it's bad luck on your part and now you're having to do this, or you feel like you're obliged to do it to feel good. Whereas a woman doing it for performance benefits, it can kind of go, you know what, the deepening of the voice is what it is. I want to get these improvements. Excessive hair growth, as you would kind of expect. The use of in women can lead to mild increases in hair growth, characterized by the growth of really just body hair anywhere, just like similar to how a man would be. The onset of steroid-induced hair growth appears slow, typically taking 4 to 6 months to become apparent, which could suggest shorter cycles or infrequent ones, or just it only really happening once, could be the way around this for women choosing to go down this path. But obviously, if you're on hormone replacement therapy, which is prolonged, then unfortunately that's the case. Enlargement of the clitoris can also occur. So clitoral growth is another effect observed in women using steroids. Now, studies involving female to male transsexual patients undergoing testosterone treatment have reported an increase in clitoral length over several months. The growth tends to plateau after a certain period. I guess just like penis growth, you're not going to just get to 80 and it'll be 8, 9, 10 inches long. It just hits a point and stops there. But because at the end of the day, there's still going to be a physiological limit. It's just, this is a supraphysiological limit. You're going to have two. Just finding it in certain aspects is easier than others. It's important to note that these effects can have significant physiological and emotional impacts on women, as I've already stated, especially with things like deepening of voice, hairier bodies, so on and so forth. While some effects may be reversible upon cessation of steroid use, irreversible changes such as the deepening of the voice can also occur, as I've already stated as well, and the threshold for developing these effects may vary based on the type of dosage used, as well as the individual factors. Now, I don't know if things like the deepening of the voice can be like you hit it, you start noticing your voice is changing, you come back down and it stops there, or if it hits a point and then it's just a cascade that you can't stop. That it didn't seem to clarify. Now, additionally, steroid use in women can disrupt fertility just like it can in men by suppressing gonadotropin production, leading to the menstrual cycle irregularities. Some women lose the period completely. Some just it becomes infrequent or sporadic. Some even really adverse, and you can have increased frequency. Due to the potential for serious and irreversible side effects, the use of steroids in women is generally discouraged, and the healthcare providers should be vigilant in addressing the health concerns of female steroid users. That pulled directly from the study. With that, we come to the end of this episode. So what do you think? Are you now someone who feels like you don't understand why anyone would do this? Do you now think it is now clear why anyone would choose to use exogenous steroid use? That the gains are clearly worth the risks and you understand why? Or is it something you think you understand now why the elite use it, but anyone recreationally, clearly the gains are superficial to some extent? Assuming someone is not using it for therapeutic usages, why would you want to use it for a purely recreational and somewhat ego and vanity boosting reasons? So thank you for listening to this episode of the VO2 Lounge podcast. For more content like this, explore my previous episodes and consider following, rating and sharing the podcast with your friends. Share your thoughts or suggest future topics at either the VO2Lounge@gmail.com or the VO2 Lounge Discord server. Links all down below in the description. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, it's goodbye.